Goldie, thank you so much for joining. We've known each other for a long time, but this is going to be a different kind of conversation. It's a conversation about intersectionality. Um, is it okay to kind of talk about your story, your experience?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I always want to ask that kind of just, it's implied, obviously, because we are doing an interview, but I think it's always important to ask that question because I was having a conversation with Touré recently, and it was like, and we're talking about it's not incumbent upon somebody else to explain their identity.
Mhm.
It's incumbent upon people to do the research. But in the context of talking about anti-racism, I think this is a different kind of conversation. So where I wanted to start was obviously when we look at different identities and intersectionality, where they meet and converge, and they make things difficult or where those invisible barriers exist. Just kind of walk me through what you've experienced your entire
Abs-
career.
my entire career. I know.
Start anywhere.
Start anywhere in my entire career. Well, it's good my career is so long, so I have many experiences to pull from. When I think about intersectionality, I think about both the positive experiences I've had and then, of course, the negative experiences. So I want to always start from a place of positivity, and I think one of the places that I personally am so excited for intersectionality is when I am able to bring other people from other backgrounds onto stage with me. So, just
Mm.
like used to do a little bit more of this, Jeff, but I do a ton of this now, is a ton of public speaking. And occasionally I'm tasked with filling up a panel and bringing other people onto stage with me. And I really like to be thoughtful about who it is that I'm bringing on stage with me. I like to be thoughtful about what are their stories in relation to my stories? How are they different? Because I think it's so helpful to have many different points of view and different experiences, bringing those to the table. And even within the greater Asian diaspora, there are so many subsets of identities and histories behind that as well. So I'm definitely always thinking about what what is our racial background or what is our ethnic background and how does that inform, and of course socioeconomic background, and how does that inform who we are today and the points of views and identities that we bring to the table.
No, that's incredibly important. I mean, representation not only isn't just some kind of vanity play. It's to have better conversation and better experience, right? If you can bring in different people's learned and lived experience, you're going to have a better conversation. You're going to have better marketing. You're going to have better everything if you've expanded your thought. You're going to grow as a human when you understand other people's perspectives, especially in an era of echo chambers.
Yes, I think we have so many, and it's very, very tempting, right? It's very tempting to sit with everyone who absolutely agrees with you and have a wonderful echo chamber where everyone says, yes, you're absolutely right. I 1,000% agree with you, and no one that offers a different opinion. But this is why, for example, I think it's really interesting to visit Dallas, Texas for me, because I live in Los Angeles and Dallas is a purple state in the US. And what I mean by that, and Jeff, you know what I mean by that, is there is a broad range of political views that exist there. In that particular city, in that area, you have people who are on the very liberal end, you have people who are on the very conservative end, you have people who are more in the middle. And I think it's so helpful to even just politically know what are other people thinking who are outside of your personal political bubble.
Yeah, I mean, I live in one of the six most important swing states in the country, so I deeply understand. We're like people be like, "Hey, I haven't seen a presidential candidate in like 3 months." I'm like, "Oh yeah, they were here this week." Yeah, no, I it's very hard to pinpoint specific examples. Sometimes maybe it isn't. Are there times you can look back and go, "Yeah, I definitely experienced racism. Um, trust me. But
I'm
do
laughing so
you?
hard.
Yeah. Because there's a second part to this question. Because the first part is super obvious. It's like,
Right.
hey, have you lived through it? Of course.
Yes, of
But
course.
do you feel it more in the moment, or is it something where you're just trying to get through and then you more reflect on it later? Because I've had people tell me these things either way.
So there's also gradations to racism, right? I've had the
Yeah.
really, interesting microaggressions that are the little things. And then I've had the big, capital R racism things happen to me. I like to give this funny example. I know we're trying to talk about serious things, but I always want to inject some levity in this. I was visiting a country that's not Asian, and I was one of their first Asian speakers they've ever had at this conference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the conference organizer wanted to take me to his, and everybody else who's a speaker, to his favorite restaurant in this country that, once again, isn't Asian or American or the UK. And he's like, Goldie, you're going to love this restaurant. It's up your alley. And I was like, oh, I'm so excited. Like, what kind of local delicacy are we going to have? And we went to a Benihana's. Now
Shout out to Steve Aoki's family.
Shout out to Steve Aoki. Now I have in my day been to many Benihanas as a younger person, and for those of you who may not know, as this is an international audience, Benihana's is a Japanese teppanyaki, grill place, and they have a routine that they do. And also, I'm not going to call it this country because then people might know what conference this is for, but it was exactly the same routine, the same smoking onion. Me and the one other Asian person in the entire restaurant, aka the chef, were looking at each other, and we just exchanged that look of, oh, and that's one of those times where it was definitely, I would still say, a lowercase racism. It was definitely a little bit of racism, but it was well-intentioned. It was clearly this person's favorite restaurant. He was so excited to take us all there. And it was one of those moments where you decide whether you are going to educate in that moment or if you're going to let it go. And I think that's a lot of how I deal with when I get situations like this is, do you educate in that moment? Do you spend that extra energy educating and saying why this is maybe not a good idea? Or do you just roll with it and say, well, thank you for taking me to clearly your favorite restaurant. And we brush under the table that you're only doing this because I am your first and hopefully not last Asian speaker at your conference.
Well, that's the thing that's so hard, right? It's picking your moments again. And as I preface this at the beginning, it is not incumbent upon you at all times to explain things to people. But if we also don't explain things to well-intentioned people, then they just keep making the mistake over and over again.
Right.
And so that's part of the things that you have to learn. I think you want people to get to a point, and look, as a straight white male, I try and stay in a point where I am perpetually of the mind that I don't know enough. And I will just continue to try and learn more and more. And I will ask dumb questions if needed, because I think that's important. But
and I can only speak for my own my
absolutely.
own experience and my own race, my own ethnicity. And I don't try not to speak for other people of color either. So for me, it's really also, I try to be really thoughtful about who I represent and who I speak for in any space, right?
Well, I think that's really accurate, right? Again, because then then you are trying to project that onto someone else, right? Like, we're all capable of experiencing some kind of lowercase or uppercase racism.
Right.
We also are capable of doing it ourselves, unintentionally or intentionally, right? And sometimes it's the unintentional, right, that feels very
Yes.
intentional in the moment. And
Yes.
so I mean, but as the Oprah of LinkedIn, that is not a term that I gave you, nor that you
No.
gave yourself, Huffington Post, to cite it. But as the Oprah of LinkedIn, like do you feel like it's more incumbent for you to try and stay kind and neutral in the face of, because you get this online. You get this online a lot.
Yes. Yes. I actually get it online a lot. And as the, Oprah of LinkedIn, especially on LinkedIn, I get it a lot more than people think you would get it on a platform like LinkedIn, especially when
True.
on LinkedIn, it's literally tied to your job and where you probably live, which it's always.
That part shocks me. That part shocks me at all. Like if you like, not to excuse it all, but if it's on Reddit, I understand it more than if it's on
If
LinkedIn.
it's anonymous, I understand it, or sometimes even when it's in person, not great, but someone may not be capturing that interaction. But when it's on LinkedIn and it's tied to your current job role, it's tied to probably your real name, it's tied to where you're located, that to me is shocking that you would do something that someone else could track later and could affect your employment. And that's just a common sense thing to perhaps not think about that. But I guess that's the point of dealing with and thinking about racism or microaggressions is you're not thinking about it. It is a gut reaction that you're doing to someone else based off your experiences or your upbringing and perhaps choices that you are actively making in the moment.
Yeah. Do you ever have moments where you know for certain that you haven't gotten things, or speaking gigs, jobs, etc.,
Yeah.
or is it just kind of implied?
I think that there are certain moments, there's certainly a lot of moments where I have a gut feeling that I definitely didn't get things. And as you brought up, speaking gigs is a really common one for me. So speaking gigs or when I work with brands, brand deals, and I just know because the slate of people that they've picked are quite frankly all not people of color. They're all white, right? And so at the end of the day, it's pretty obvious when someone is actively choosing to not choose a person of color and then of course not choose me. And you can tell by the end results of something. And there's been times when people have said, it's funny to me too, because if you close your eyes and you listen to my voice and you listen to my dictation, I've definitely had people say they don't expect me to be Asian, right? My voice doesn't sound, I don't have an accent, I don't necessarily sound Asian. I dictate apparently just like a white New Yorker is what I get a lot for some reason, or like white Chicagoan, which I'm like, I don't know where I get that at all because I'm from the Bay Area.
No, because then you would know what to order at Portillo's.
Yeah, I don't
No.
think so at all.
No, but you have a non-regional diction because
I have a
you've spoken
non-regional.
everywhere.
I have a non-regional diction. I've spoken everywhere. And have I done diction courses and classes in my youth? Yes, I have. And it's very purposeful that I have a non-regional diction. But at the same time, it's really interesting when people are shocked that I have this particular diction. And I'll shout out actually something that I think is a really interesting case study. So I was up for a role with, and I won't say what it was, but it was an agency working with country music television, CMT. And we had a long talk about my resume, which was actually perfect for the particular role they were looking for at this agency, working with country music television. Now, for country music television, they're maybe looking for a certain demographic of person that isn't an Asian American female, let's be honest. And so they heard my voice and they thought, great. And halfway through the conversation, there was a pause and the person actually said, wait, are you Asian? And then they had to take it back because they realized what they had asked. And they said, oh, ha ha ha. Anyways, next question. And because they had realized my last name, it was a video. It wasn't a video call. It was a voice call. Is Chan, Chan, which is a pretty traditionally Chinese last name or Asian last name. And they realized I said it out loud and then had to backtrack because in America, we have laws against this, but doesn't mean that people aren't still hiring in a specific way and just ignoring those laws.
Right, of course. I mean that happens all the time. I would have been wild to see you working. Just knowing you enough to be wild to see you working.
I mean, knowing my brand, it would have been wild for me to work at CMT. But there's some country music I listen to, and let's be honest, right now Beyonce is having a country moment in a really fascinating way. So
I believe that's a country song. That's just a hot take.
Hot take. Hot take moment.
It does not matter who creates the song. If it sounds like a country song and it slaps like a country song, then it is a country song. That is my hot take in this. But being more serious,
yes.
Are there specific industries, specific places where you feel like you've encountered, tougher, like those experiences that we talked about on the line where you're like, do I say something? Do I not say something?
So I think a lot of my work actually in startups, right, which was my experience before becoming the Oprah of LinkedIn, I worked a lot behind the scenes in startups, and it is a predominantly white workforce. And there have been so many times, especially when I was younger, and you don't feel empowered to say something, period, right? No matter what happens. But especially there were many, many, many moments where I was put in uncomfortable positions, where I wanted to say something, but didn't feel it was okay to say something. And especially around race, and especially around inappropriate things being said about my race and inappropriate comments said to me. And so I think that there were so many moments that I wish that I had felt more empowered in those moments to specifically say something and stand up and be more proactive about advocating for myself in those situations, and also for, honestly, sometimes for other people too.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we try and impart on younger people, but we're also coming from a position of having more power now in our career, and so we don't understand that part. That's another part of intersectionality, right? It's it's race, it's gender, but it's also position of power, and what can you say and what can you do, and what are you willing to tolerate? As much as we like to believe that the climate changes, right? That it incrementally gets better. It also, there's always a pendulum swing, right? You made a good point too about tech. Fun, inclusive culture, right? Inclusive startup culture. We've got a ping pong table, right? But it did look like an Abercrombie and Fitch ad just for tech developers.
Right. And there's a lot of, not helping with the situation, especially when I worked in tech, which was, quite a bit ago. And I think a lot about the alcohol culture in it, and also just being a woman in tech. There was certainly a lot of that even just being a woman in tech, whether a white woman or a non-white woman, not easy as well, because it is a very bro-friendly culture that if you're not one of the bros, then you're not okay. I remember there was one startup that I worked at, and I realized I wasn't getting a promotion because every week the guys, including the CEO, would get together and get just super, super, super drunk at his house. And I was, of course, not invited. Myself and none of the women were invited to this, except for one woman. And we don't need to get into how that maybe turned into a lawsuit later. But right? But none of the
you start describing the situation, and I'm like, this is 90% turning into a bad situation, just based on where you were setting it up.
Right, but essentially, like, no other women were really invited regularly to this party, and so I remember one of the younger guys who was at the same level as me, he was up for so many more promotions than I was. And because he was drinking with the CEO, right? And I think a lot about that in tech, and I think that's still prevalent today. Now, I am not working 9 to 5 in tech anymore, but from what I hear from other women still in tech, that still exists today. That still is something that still happens today.
I think that's true in a lot of different areas, right? Even if it gets a little better, right? Even if that funding, goes from, let's just say 2% to 8% female funded, right? It's probably, I'm guessing numbers, but I don't think I'm far off.
I don't think you're far off.
but these are the things, right? Because obviously human nature dictates that people hire who they hang out with, who they find familiar, right? Who they bond with, right? And so, however benign that person might think that situation is, it isn't. So really systemically, where we need to change things the most, right, are twofold, right? It's on the macro scale, it is definitely where are things funded? Who is funding these things?
Yes.
Who is in leadership?
Yes.
So that, because if you have, diverse people and females in the room, they will be able to quickly tell you, this is stupid. Don't do that. Right. Or how about we do something better? But also, so that's the macro scale of, right, we don't really fully fix, trying to fully fix the issue of that, has existed throughout time is incredibly difficult. It should not be tried to be tackled in a year. But, if you can start to chip away at some of the larger, top of the pyramid parts of power, that helps. But it's the other part that we allude back to in the earlier part of the conversation, which is it's those smaller moments. It's letting someone know, hey, this is why we feel left out. This is why things can't grow. And again, and I pause everywhere to say that stuff is tough. Because you are trying to grow in your career. You're trying to move up.
And it's emotional labor that you shouldn't have to do. I shouldn't have to do that emotional labor in that moment. I shouldn't have to potentially not get hired again because I said something in that moment. And I do think it is twofold in that it is education, but putting the onus of education on a person of color is already a lot, right? And I do agree that the other part of that is financial, making sure that people have the funding or are getting hired or those doors are open in a significant way to people who maybe didn't previously have those opportunities. I think a lot about who we're opening the door for next and who is important to talk to and spotlight. So one of the things that I do, which Jeff, is I write for Forbes, and I try to spotlight a lot of people of color and a lot of businesses run by people of color, because it's so important that in a publication that traditionally may not spotlight naturally as many people of color, it's important for me to be a journalist who does that. And that's one of the ways I think you can be really impactful, is whatever power and also whatever platform you have to spotlight as many people of color as possible, people within your own community, people within sister communities. I think it's very helpful to think that way, and then to think about who you are helping up the chain, right? If you can open a door, who can you help open a door for? And I wish that in every moment that I did education to someone who is not a person of color, or let's be honest, a person of color who doesn't understand something within the Asian culture, which happens too, I wish that every single time that would land and that person would be like, I'm a changed person. I'm going to tell 20 people. And just like any education, it doesn't help to do it just once. If hearing it repeatedly is helpful, that's probably what's going to change that person's point of view. That's more likely the thing that will help educate them, is if they hear it more than once. But it's already so difficult to even do it the one time, to educate someone the one time, to have it repeated can be even more difficult.
And you don't know the response, right? Some people are, it's going to be jarring when someone confronts, ooh, right? And they either get defensive or they want to learn. And
Right.
you, on the other end, have no idea. And again, yes, not incumbent upon you. Dr. Raquel Martin does a great job of explaining, like, do you want to know why your employee of color, or who is female, or has any, layer of intersectionality or, identity, why they're so tired? It's because they have all these other invisible things that they have to think about in that moment, right? A lot of the 2010s was a culture of hustle culture and,
Yes.
be bold and be loud and speak up. And it's
Yes.
like, yeah, but speaking up when you are, in a position that is not of power is incredibly, there's just more time you have to put into thinking about, well, I don't know if I can, just move fast and break stuff.
Right. And I think most people who have maybe never had to speak up and never advocate for themselves in positions that are precarious, I've definitely talked to people like that who maybe grew up very privileged, and maybe they already have access to a lot of different things that other people naturally don't. And they think, of course, tell them exactly what you think. Don't worry about the consequences, Goldie, because it's better you should say how you feel. I always feel better. And I've had these conversations with people and I have to explain. In that case, then I can explain and educate. Well, not everyone has that luxury of saying how they really feel in certain situations, because they won't be hired back. They won't be brought back. They won't have that next career move up. And these moments in people's careers are helpful to, what am I trying to say there? I want to say that having a moment like that in a career and making the decision to say something or to not say something, I don't think reflects necessarily morally on you, because it might just be a difficult moment for you to say what you really think. And it might be the thing that decides between you getting your promotion and then you being able to open doors for other people versus you not getting that promotion.
The moment I realized I had privilege the most, especially in my 20s, was when I didn't have to think before I speak, which is a very crazy thing for a public relations person to
Yes.
not be like, I was like, I would give advice early days of Twitter. I'd be like, you just gotta, I'm like, wait a minute, this is dumb. Because again, my experience is not your experience, which is not someone else's.
Well, we were all giving dumb advice in the early days of Twitter, I want to say.
We still are.
We
Trust
still
me.
are.
We're going to look back on it. I feel like this every time. We're going to look back on this 5 years from now and 5 years later and 5 years from there, and we're always going to find growth. All right. So to close, when you're talking to younger people who are in their career, quietly dealing with lowercase or uppercase racism, what's your best advice? Where are the resources? What are the outlets? What are your best, I guess, options?
Yeah, I would start with two things. Find your voice, what you really feel, and then find your boundaries, right? And I say that because it's important to know how you actually feel in that situation. It's important to validate what you feel is absolutely okay. And then in the second case, what are your boundaries? When will you say something and when will you not say something? Sometimes it's helpful to know that if it's a massive transgression, absolutely you will. And sometimes it's helpful that quite frankly, there's certain gradations of microaggressions you will address and some that you won't. Maybe you'll address some of these with humor. Maybe you'll address some of them very seriously, because even if they're small, they need to be addressed really seriously. I think it's helpful to know what those boundaries are. And in all cases, the third part to this is community. Having people in your community that you can talk to about these things. It's the infamous GC, group chat, right? Having a group chat that you can talk about these issues freely with other people who understand and have experienced what you go through is so helpful. And that might be anywhere from, I'm definitely part of a couple of different really interesting Asian Facebook groups where people just say, is this normal that my immigrant parents said this? Mm-hmm. Or is it normal that I love boba tea so much? So they're just the broad range of things, right? And what's helpful to be in those, it's helpful to be in those groups and to be able to ask a question like that and to have other people who have a closer, more similar shared experience to you say, oh yes, like I've experienced that with my immigrant parents too. Or yes, I'm drinking boba tea right now. I don't know. Having, I think, either of those play into how you think about also how you're going to express yourself about your race or about how you feel in that moment. It also is a great way to have a place where you can let off steam or ask a question. Hey, this happened to me today. How would you react to this, right? And what's fascinating is, especially in these larger groups, you'll see the whole gamut of reactions. You'll have people say, I would have addressed it in the moment. I would have shouted at them. I would have said this and that and the other thing. And you'll have other people be like, oh, I would have taken a day. I would have cooled down. I would have really thought about if I even want to say something. Or other people be like, I would have brought my boss into that situation, or I would have brought someone else into that situation. And I think it's helpful to sometimes get that group survey to see what other reactions are, honestly, to help validate that whatever your reaction is, it's 100% valid.
I think that's so important. Community is so important. And then also understanding that, and I think this is another big takeaway, is that no group is a monolith. There are a lot. We're all different. We all process things differently. Everybody's had different experiences. There are obviously things we can see, but we don't know internally what you have experienced. And
right.
So it's incumbent upon people in positions of power or more privilege to be mindful and try and ascertain and try and be better allies. And then also, try to not be perfect, because you're never going to be perfect.
But Jeff, it's so tempting to always be perfect.
No, it's not. No, that sounds stressful. I don't like it. Please no. Goldie, thank you so much for sharing your time, your experience. And, hopefully if a few people can learn something or feel more empowered from this conversation, then it's a drop in a much larger ocean that will hopefully eventually get better.
Yes, absolutely. And as always, I hope that people find their community, they find their people, they find a place that they can feel connected to and safe. And I think if you have that, then it makes intersectionality so much easier too.
Thanks so much.